at the end of February 2022, days after the invasion, Zelensky appointed his best friend named David Arahamia. Okay, he's head of his faction in the parliament. He went to first to Belarus and then to Istanbul and negotiated a decent end to this war. It was initialed by Arachamia and by Putin's. It was under the personal supervision of Putin and Zelensky. They wanted to get this thing behind them, right? And so they initial this thing. Next thing you know, the Boris Johnson comes in, Prime Minister of Britain, and on instructions from the U.S. and the others said, "Don't sign that, Zelensky. If you sign that, you're in trouble because we're not going to support you. And you know what? If you do sign it, we're going to arm you to the teeth, more even, and we're going to support you for as long as it takes."
Hi, I'm John Kiriakou, and welcome back to Deep Focus. Before we start, if you enjoy these conversations as much as we do, please do us the favor of liking, subscribing, and even sharing it so we can spread the word to your friends. Today, we want to talk about Russia and Ukraine. You wouldn't even remember necessarily that Russia is in the news because of the news coming out of the Middle East. That seems to be what most Americans are focused on. But the war between Russia and Ukraine is still quite active and ongoing, with no real end in sight. President Trump was elected with a promise that he could settle this fight in 24 hours. Nobody really believed that was possible. And as it turned out, maybe we're looking at 24 months instead of 24 hours. And that's if we were to become lucky. But most Americans, it seems to me, don't understand the Russian side of this thing. The Russians don't trust the United States to be the honest broker in this conflict, because it was the United States that overthrew a democratically elected pro-Russian government in Ukraine in 2014. Things just got worse from there. We're going to talk to somebody today who is an expert on these issues. He's also a dear friend of mine. Ray McGovern is an American political activist, and he's a former senior CIA officer. He was a CIA analyst from 1963 to 1990. And in the late 1980s and early 1990s, or into 1990, he was President George H.W. Bush's morning intelligence briefer. Ray received the Intelligence Commendation Medal upon his retirement, but he returned it to the CIA in 2006 to protest the CIA's involvement in torture. In 2003, he co-founded Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, VIPS, of which I'm a proud member. Ray, welcome back to the show. It's so great to see you again.
Thank you, John. Glad to be with you.
Thank you, Ray. Ray, you and I have been texting the last day or so to prepare for this episode. And you mentioned Russia's core interests. Russia, like every other country in the world, has core interests. It has national interests, but we seem to either ignore them or not recognize them in the first place. What are Russia's core interests vis-a-vis Ukraine?
Well, I like to go back, John, to the person who brought me down to Washington, or spurred me to go down to Washington. That's John F. Kennedy. I entered the CIA 5 months before he was killed, and I think I know who killed him. In any case, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we came very close, really, really close to extinguishing each other, the Soviet Union and the U.S., and maybe the rest of life on the planet. And John, a little personal thing, I was just entering on active duty as a second lieutenant Army infantry officer at Fort Benning during the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I had to do my 2 years, and that's when I was called to duty. Now, the curious thing was that, this was a hotshot Army infantry and instruction base, and there were no weapons there. And a lot of us were, hot on looking at these new weapons like a grenade launcher, my God, and an M16, and it's a M1, right? And there weren't any. And so I got up the courage to ask one of these senior sergeants, "Hey, Sergeant, wonder why there are no weapons here at this Army Infantry Training Center?" He said, "Oh, two divisions came by 2 weeks ago, took all our weaponry, and they're down in Key West now, Florida. They're about to go off after Cuba." I said, "Oh, isn't that interesting?" So that's a personal experience, how close we came. If JFK wasn't sensible enough to have people like Llewellyn Thompson, the previous ambassador to the Soviet Union, other level-headed people, that would have been it. Now, the reason I mention that background is because after that, after he and Khrushchev faced the situation where they both realized that they were playing with destruction, utter destruction. Um, John Kennedy made a speech at the American University early June. I was just on duty with the CIA for a couple of months, right? And he said, "Look, the worst thing we can do in these kinds of circumstances is not try to empathize with the other side. Actually, the really worst thing we can do is give another nuclear power the poison choice between humiliating defeat and using nuclear weapons." Okay, that's what had happened. He had challenged Khrushchev, and Khrushchev had had the good sense to say, "Oh my God, it's better to accept a sort of sotto voce deal," which they did, but a humiliating defeat, because I don't want to blow up the rest of the world. Okay. Now, there was a rapprochement starting there. Khrushchev and Kennedy had a really good relationship. When that speech was given, Khrushchev ordered it to be posted in toto in
Oh,
Pravda and Izvestia. He called in Harriman. He said, "This is the best speech ever an American president give." And the next thing you knew, we had an arms control agreement for testing on over the ground. So all I'm saying here is that our core interests were deeply affected by what Khrushchev did. He said he wouldn't do it. He did anyway. Offensive strike missiles in Cuba. Now, we didn't know it at the time. They were armed. They had nuclear tips on them. We didn't know it. When Ray Klein, who was the head analyst at CIA at the time, the so-called deputy director for intelligence, when he was asked by President Kennedy, "Are they armed?" He said, "I don't know. We can't tell. There's too much cloud cover. We didn't have satellites, and we didn't. We had limited collection means." So we learned 30 years later, yeah, they were
wow.
armed. So that's how close we came. Now, the point I'm making here is that we lucked out because Khrushchev backed down. All those weapons in Key West would have been used, and the Russians would have come in big time. Okay. Now, what does that mean with respect to Ukraine? Well, Russia has core interests, just like we did with respect to missiles in Cuba, and they didn't want a highly armed Ukraine as a part of NATO right on their doorstep. I mean, you could understand why they might like that, especially after the coup that you just mentioned on February 14th, 2000. I'm sorry, February in February 2014. So, what happened? Well, the Russians were really upset about what the NATO was doing, arming these people, training them up to NATO standards, for God's sake. They started doing that in 2014. Not only did Boris Johnson come in later and say, "No, you gotta accept our aid," but John Brennan came in and said, "Well, look, you fight now. You fight now. We'll arm you, and you keep fighting." And there were a couple of agreements there, both of which the West violated. So we come down to 2021. This is important. It's on the final exam for those of you listening, so you want to take a note here. Okay. Now, things are getting worse and worse, and the Russians said, look, we have core interests, and they have to do with Ukraine. And look, we would like to negotiate a treaty with you and with NATO. And we have the head of NATO saying, they offered us a treaty, and we said no. Jens Stoltenberg. Okay, we said no. And so this was a condition. They said if you don't stop trying to get Ukraine in NATO, we will have to invade Ukraine. And we said no. And so he invaded Ukraine. Now, says Stoltenberg, and this is a symptom of how the quality of leadership in NATO. Stoltenberg says, he said this 2 years ago. So they didn't want NATO enlargement, but they got two new NATO's members, Sweden and Finland. So they got NATO enlargement anyway. Witness the fact that about 1 million Ukrainian and young Russian soldiers had perished by that time. Okay. No need for this war. So let me just get a little bit particular now. After the U.S. said no, and after Stoltenberg for NATO said no, Putin addressed his military leadership. I'm talking about all the equivalent 4-stars and the defense minister and so forth. That was on the 21st of 2021. Okay. So it was February 2022 when the war started. Okay. So he says to these guys, he says, what really bothers me most is the U.S. has installations in Romania and in Poland with these canisters already mounted. We can't see what's in the canisters. They could have, guess what? Tomahawk missiles. They could have other cruise missiles and all kinds of missiles to make a first strike on us. Now, that's bad enough, says he to these military leaders. But guess what? They're going to put them in Ukraine. And what does that mean? That means I will have 5 minutes. 5 minutes to decide whether to retaliate with nuclear weapons. So I wasn't a fly on the wall, but I said, how is the military going to react to this? Well, guess what? 9 days later, on the 30th of January, the White House gets a call from Putin, from the Kremlin. Mr. Putin would like to talk to Mr. Biden right away, please. Well, wait a second now. They just talked 2 weeks ago, and they set up this negotiating system in Geneva, just 10 days away. Why is he waiting? Look, please, we'd like to talk to Mr. Biden, right away. So, to his credit, I guess, Biden takes the call. Where is he? He's in a strange place called Delaware. Okay. Now, he was home alone for Christmas. Okay. Sullivan, Blinken, they weren't there. So Putin says, look, we have these negotiations starting on the 9th of January. It would be really terrific. And I'm feeling a little pressure from my military. Really terrific if you said that you would not put offensive strike missiles in Ukraine, giving me 5 minutes to. Biden thinks this sounds like a good idea to him. So he says, okay. And the readout reads, Biden said that Washington has no intention of putting offensive strike missiles in Ukraine, period, end quote. Whoa. Now, in reality, that promise or that undertaking embraced most of the Russian terms in those treaties. I mean, the next day was New Year's Eve, and Ushakov, who most people are familiar with, he's Putin's right-hand person for these, he was waxing eloquent. My God, finally, the Americans are recognizing that we have core interests in Ukraine, right? So what happens? And I won't be much longer. So that was the 30th of December, 2021. On the 9th of January, as prearranged by Putin and Biden 3 weeks before, Wendy Sherman she's Deputy Secretary of State. You know about her.
I worked for her in Pakistan.
What's that?
I worked for her in Pakistan.
Okay. So now Wendy, you know, she had to follow instructions, I guess. That's what State departments do. So here comes Ryabkov, the deputy foreign minister, and he's all enthusiastic. He says, wow, okay, Wendy, let's get down to brass tacks now. Let's work out this arrangement where the undertaking not to put offensive strike missiles in Ukraine, we can flesh it out and agree. And Wendy says, huh? Come again? I said, the president's conversation with Putin on the 30th. I don't know anything about that. I don't have no instructions on that. What are you talking about? So 10 days after that call, this is what she says. Okay. Now, later in January, Lavrov, the foreign minister, gets a hold of Blinken. They both happen to be in Geneva at the same time. And Lavrov was usually pretty polite. I imagine what he said to Blinken was, what the hell's going on here? The president promises not to put offensive strike missiles in Ukraine, and your negotiators don't know anything. What's going on? And Blinken says, and we have this directly from Lavrov, and of course, events prove it's right. He says, look, the president was home alone. I wasn't with him. Sullivan wasn't with him. Forget about it. Look, we have every right to put offensive strike missiles in Ukraine, and we will do it if they ask us. Now, we might be able to talk about how many missiles put in Ukraine, but forget about this thing. It's not going to happen, okay? That was the 21st of January, okay? On the 12th of February was the last telephone conversation between Biden and Putin. The readout says Biden refused to talk about offensive strike missiles in Ukraine, as he had promised not to do in December. And he refused to talk about the business of Ukraine going into NATO or not. So that's the 12th of February. Now, concurrent with that, the shelling of the Donbas, the shelling of Russian-speaking citizens there in the Donbas, increased geometrically. I forget the figures.
Actually, you sent me some slides from a talk that you gave at the University of Southern California. I'm looking at it right now. The number of shells went from, let's see, on February 14th, 2022, they went from about 50 to almost 1,500 exactly 1 week later.
That's right. Yeah. Geometric? Yeah, I would say so.
Oh, I would say so. Yes. Agreed.
So that was the other thing. Now, the reason I mention all this is because most Americans have been brainwashed. I hate to use the word, but you know that it's true, John. They've been brainwashed to think that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was unprovoked. It was full scale, and it was illegal. Now, Richard Falk, who wrote the book on international law, the book that most of my lawyer colleagues studied in law school, says, look, the law on what Putin did going into Ukraine is unsettled, okay? You'll have lawyers that say this, lawyers that say that. Falk leans toward the interpretation that no, this was under Article 51. This was not illegal, but we'll leave that aside. How about full scale. Give me a break. The Russians had about 95,000 troops that they sent up toward Kiev full scale. Give me a break. Okay. What was the purpose of that? The purpose of that was scare the hell out of Zelensky. Did it work? Yeah, it worked. Days after the invasion, at the end of February 2022, days after the invasion, Zelensky appointed his best friend named David Arahamia. Okay, he's head of his faction in the parliament.
Parliament.
He went to first to Belarus and then to Istanbul and negotiated a decent end to this war. It's it was initialed by Arachamia and by Putin's. It was under the personal supervision of Putin and Zelensky. They wanted to get this thing behind them, right? And so they initial this thing. Next thing you know, the Boris Johnson comes in, Prime Minister of Britain, and on instructions from the U.S. and the others, said, "Don't sign that, Zelensky. If you sign that, you're in trouble because we're not going to support you. And you know what? If you do sign it, we're going to arm you to the teeth, more even, and we're going to support you for as long as it takes." Well, to shorten this, now is as long as it takes. The Russians are able now to break through to the Dnieper River anytime they damn well please. They're not going to do it. They're going to do it in an attrition sort of way, but that attrition can be stepped up as it has been over the last week or two. So the Russians hold the high cards. The other thing that is important to emphasize with respect to the not full scale, those troops. Do you remember, John, that they stayed on the road toward Kiev? I mean, God, that for a week or two. I'm saying, my God, about infiltrate. Yeah, they were sitting targets, but the negotiations are going on. The negotiations were succeeding, and as soon as they were initialed, Putin withdrew those troops. I mean, okay, as an act of goodwill. So, was it full scale? No. Was it unprovoked? I think I've said enough about whether it was provoked or unprovoked. Russian core interests were involved, and they're still insisting that these core interests be appreciated or be taken into account in any deal. They're not going to stop until they have made sure those core interests are taken seriously by the U.S. and by the Europeans, and the U.S. and Europeans are doing crazy things now. The Europeans, especially. I asked some people who know about Europe more than I do why it is that these European leaders are so stupid in thinking they can prevail against Russia. And the answer is, they're so tightly politicized, they're so tightly committed to this that it would just be a disaster for them politically to admit, oh, we were wrong about this whole stuff. We were wrong about for as long as it takes. We wasted several $billions and you guys are in bad shape politically, and actually the social services are not what they should. So sorry about that. Well, they can't possibly do that. That's so the Europeans are leading Trump by the nose this week. Last thing I'll say is yesterday or the day before, the U.S. Decided, or Trump decided, well, we'll put in sanctions, more sanctions on
Right.
two
Yes.
major U.S. oil companies. Okay. Now, how did Putin react to that? Just yesterday, he was having meetings and he did a little press conference and he said, this is not going to help improving U.S. Russia's relations. They were just beginning to climb out of their state of complete disrepair. That's not going to help that, but it's not going to do anything else. We're pretty much immune to sanctions. It'll hurt us, but it sort of gives us pause as to whether the person we're talking to, Trump, is serious. Now, interestingly enough, Putin never mentions Trump. Okay, never says, it's his fault. They're still trying to treat him with kid gloves. Why? Because he's so unpredictable, because he has his fingers on the nuclear codes. And so you have Putin bending over backwards in a kind of obsequious way, saying, "Oh yeah, the president should have got the Nobel Peace Prize," and the president, blah blah blah. And people say, "Vladimir, for God's sake, why?" Anyhow, so he's very very careful about it. The last thing I'll say, it just came on my radar screen, is that the deputy Foreign Secretary Ryabkov has made a point of saying, "Look, there's an offer on the table. September 22nd, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin said that, look, New START treaty, the only one still in place, is expiring on February 5th. There's nothing we can do at this point to resuscitate it, but as long as you agree to do the same, we agree to keep the quantitative limits on offensive strategic missiles in place." I think it's 1555 on each side. It's 1550, I think it is. It's a big improvement from what existed before. So that's the offer on the table, okay? Besides, we don't want you to do any crazy things like space projects. Now, Ryabkov mentioned that just this week, saying, "Look, this is not an offer without a time limit. The U.S. has to come to terms with whether they're going to agree with this or not, and that will be a bigger sanctions. Sanctions will hurt Russia, but not very much. Whether there's an agreement to abide by the quantitative limits under the New START treaty, that's big. That's a big deal." And what has Trump said? Oh, 3 weeks ago, he said, "No, it sounds like a good idea to me." And so the Russians have said, "We'd like something a little bit more official, please. Would you give us something more official?" So what I'm saying here is U.S.-Russian relations are in a state of flux. I don't see them as at the nadir. I think if Putin adopted the hard-nosed approach that Medvedev did yesterday, say, "We're at war," for God's sake, don't talk to that garrulous guy across the ocean, he's going to blame it on Congress. Doesn't matter. So you have Medvedev playing the bad cop again.
Yes, always, always. He's the king of Twitter.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And he does this on his own little social media or whatever. But Putin is a guy you have to look at. And Lavrov has made it very clear what Russian terms are. And the big thing, I'll end with this, Russia has won the war, okay?
That was, if I could interrupt you on that point, Ray. Like you, I'm friends with a lot of professors, university professors, including some of the greatest minds on contemporary Russian history and Russian relations with the United States. They are unanimous in their belief that this war is essentially over and the Russians have won. Would you agree with that?
I would say that you're talking to the right political scientists and international relations specialists like John Mearsheimer and the others. But the people who are advising Trump,
that's the issue. That's the issue right there.
The people with whom Cy Hirsch is speaking, my God, no reality there.
No reality. Well, you know what? Speaking of no reality, let's talk about a quote that you sent to me from the former NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. He said on September 7th, 2023, Putin's precondition for not invading was no Ukraine in NATO. We rejected that. So he went to war to prevent more NATO. That's the soft part that he said out loud, right?
Before the before the EU Parliament, for God's sake.
Right.
They all said, "Oh, isn't that interesting?" So, unprovoked? Give me a break.
Yeah, I think that's it. Hey, and answer something for me. I know that, and I say this every once in a while in a speech, that the Russians twice approached us about joining NATO in the 1990s and in the aughts. And they were ignored in one case and laughed at in the other. I'm not seeing a downside to Russia joining NATO. If anything, it would promote peace very broadly. What was behind the U.S. policy of just ignoring that Russian request?
Well, when the little Bush, George W. Bush, was president, Russia was on its back. We had pretty much plundered its economy. The
Right.
Wall Street guys and the Harvard boys, okay, taking advantage of that drunken guy Yeltsin.
Yep.
And Putin came in and he had very little to work with. It's a credit to him that he has built up not only the economy, but the Russian army to be the most powerful army in the world right now. And that's new for me to be able to say. There was always a balance before, but now, due to all kinds of incompetence on our side and the Russian fighting, getting the experience in Ukraine, they dwarf our ability to fight a conventional war. God help us, nuclear war, nobody wins. Okay, so that's the lay of the land on that one. I forget exactly what your question was.
Why wouldn't the United States have wanted Russia to be a member of NATO?
Hey, man, we're talking money.
Yeah.
I mean, the
Yeah.
military-industrial complex. My God,
Mhm.
what would it mean if we didn't have an enemy, a plausible enemy?
Yeah.
I'll tell you what it would mean. Back in the around 2012, 2013, Putin was acting pretty in an outreach kind of way. And there was sort of like a peaceful atmosphere. And so Maffei, the German European tank builder, common European tank was given to Maffei to build. Dead in the water, dead in the water. Who needs a common European battle tank? There's no threat. So then you have the coup in Ukraine, and Russia seizes Crimea, and then you have all kinds of Maffei had a German counterpart. Now it had a French counterpart. Now it has a German counterpart. And they fought about who has the rights to build, and they settled it out of court for mega euros, if you will. So, they're back in business. And that's what matters with these decisions with respect to you got to have a plausible enemy. And, if Putin is trying to join NATO, my God, that's, as a matter of fact, most people think that the Warsaw Pact, wow, that was the danger, That's why NATO was created, right?
Yeah.
Wrong. NATO was created 1949, the Warsaw Pact 6 or 7 years later. After Stalin died, right? Molotov and Malenkov, they reached out to NATO and said, look, we'd really like to join. That was the first time they were turned down. And Putin mentioned it in one of his recent speeches. So, it's a matter of why the West turned down. Why is not important. They turned down this overture right after a year after Stalin. Okay, and then they mentioned, well, Putin at a major gathering, he's standing at a podium here, and George W. Bush is over here, and Putin says, "Look, we offered, uh, we offered to join NATO," and Bush goes, George.
Yeah. He actually laughed.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
that's
And then
true.
Putin explained, he read the response. So, it's a matter of perception. The problem I have, of course, John, is that most Americans have been brainwashed, and that includes very, very intelligent, well-educated uh, people like my former university colleagues and so forth. They read the New York Times. They think that they can still get some truth out of the New York Times. It's not truth there. And for me to suggest these other things, well, they're automatically that's too fearful. That Russia couldn't be a threat to us. And a lot of that, John, as you know, has to do with Russiagate. And until that is owned up to, until most people see the documentary evidence that that was a charade, that was a canard, that was a red herring, there was no Russian interference in the 2016 election, and I can prove it. And the guy that's responsible mostly for promoting this legend is a fellow named John Brennan, whom we both know, and we both know personally, and we both know politically. And I understand that he's been referred by Congress to the Justice Department to answer for what he did. So, does that dominate the front page of the Washington Post and the New York Times? No. Well, where would you find it? Oh, maybe on page 17A. So unless people realize that they've been had, that since 1916, even before the election, and and Obama was responsible for this, even before the election, Russia was accused of interfering and doing all kinds of untoward things. All right, and most people still believe that. A mini fact here: Russian hacking, Democratic National Committee. The head of the cyber firm, CrowdStrike, testified on December 5th before the Schiff committee, Adam Schiff. There was no evidence, no technical evidence of any hacking by the Russians or by anything else. December 5th, 2017, Schiff kept that in a safe for 2.5 years. Okay. Then finally, somebody advising Trump said, "Hey, you're the president. You could probably you could release that yourself." Tell Schiff to release it, and he releases it. That was May 7th, 2020. You ask your friends if they know that the lie about Russian hacking of the DNC to expose Hillary and all her machinations and the DNC's machination. I mean, the head of the DNC had to quit at the time, so did the.
That's
Okay,
right.
it was very clear, but nobody knows that. So that's why I really welcome the opportunity to be with you, John, and with other people trying to pursue the truth and try, against all the odds to get the truth out. Because, you know, as my friend Jack Matlock, former president, former ambassador.
Ambassador.
I wish you were president. Former ambassador to the USSR, who was desk chief at State when I was a chief of the Soviet Foreign Policy branch back in the early 70s. Okay. As he has said recently, look, the worst thing about Russiagate is that it has prejudiced American people to think that, my God, the Russians have horns on them. And he didn't say this, but my conclusion is that if Trump and the others and the media, of course, Trump, the media, and the deep state, to include the military industrial complex, if they put out this word that Russia is just kind of going to invade some other country or something like, before you know it, most American people would approve of Trump sending our own armed forces or our own missiles into Ukraine. That's the danger here. And that's what Jet Matlock, to his very credit, he's 10 years older than I am, if you can believe it.
God bless.
Yeah. So, he feels real strongly about it. So do I. I mean, the Russians need to be looked at for what they are. They have core interests to go
They
back.
do, just like we do, just like every other country does. And Ray, there's a lot we can criticize Donald Trump about. But in many respects, Donald Trump is 100% right about wanting to engage the Russians in a diplomatic dialogue. We don't have to agree on everything. But at the very least, we should be talking to each other. You'll remember in the aughts when George W. Bush was president, I was still at the CIA, and I remember people laughing, especially the analysts laughing at how hard the George W. Bush administration worked to not talk to our enemies. We weren't allowed to talk to anybody. We weren't talking to the Russians, to the Chinese, the Cubans, the North Koreans, the this one, the that one, Iran and Iraq, and we weren't talking to anybody. Well, I just don't see a downside to diplomacy. Let the diplomats do what they're paid to do and carry out diplomacy. Is Donald Trump doing that? Or is Donald Trump like every other president?
Well, I would say that Biden was the quintessential non-talker.
Agreed.
He matched George W. Bush in spades. Nobody could talk to any Russians. And as you point out, it's different now. Very different. There are talks. There are back channel and all kinds of channels. Lavrov can call Rubio, for what that's worth, and Rubio can call. Well, it is worth something.
Sure.
They have communication. That's big. Okay, there's been a summit. There might be another summit. Okay, so that's in and of itself a really big thing. And the other thing, of course, is that at the first summit, as he's flying in, Trump says to a Fox guy, you know, if we can't emerge from this meeting without if we don't get an agreement for a ceasefire, I'll be terribly disappointed. This goes out on a wire, right? So when they meet, it's a done fact, in my view, that Trump made one last try, and he said, "Now, President Putin, let's have a ceasefire." And Putin said, I thought we made clear to you that's a no-go.
No, they're winning. Why would they want to cease fire if they're winning?
So 2 hours later, Trump does a social media thing and says, I agreed. We have to address the whole enchilada incident. We have to hold, including core interests. We don't well, now apparent he's appealing for a ceasefire like the crazy Europeans. And when Medvedev calls the Europeans crazy or dumb or worse, okay,
Yeah.
Well, I have to agree with Medvedev because they are so narrow-minded. They're such political hacks that they are sacrificing lots of troops, mostly Ukrainian troops, to satisfy their own overweening desire to stay in power and not face the embarrassment of having supported up the kazoo, so to speak, all Ukrainian demands. Now, people say, "Oh, Zelensky's such a hardliner." Well, this British running Zelensky. All we have to do is tell the British, "Hey, knock it off. This is how long it takes. We're out of there." And pretty much Vice President Vance has said that 4 weeks ago.
Yeah, that's right.
We're out of there. There's no more aid coming to Ukraine. Now, let me just finish with the syllogism that this is the plan, okay? We're going to sell weapons that we haven't really produced yet.
No, not yet. They're coming, though.
Oh, they're coming. And we're going to sell them to the Europeans who don't really have the money to buy those weapons, which aren't available yet, okay? And they're going to give them to the Ukrainians who don't have enough troops to man the weapons that we would give them. Now, outside of that, this is an incredible plan, don't you think?
Oh, yeah. Great idea. Great idea. So, Ray, where do we go from here? Is there any chance that we can have normalized relations with Russia again and maybe even an end to this conflict? And let me add a third part to the question. Is it even possible for Volodymyr Zelensky to survive this? Or he's done?
Well, I think he's done, but Putin has adopted a gradualist policy here. The advances in Donetsk and in the rest of southern Ukraine are such that even Pokrovsk, the big fortress, has now been taken. Um, how long Zelensky can stay around is anybody's guess. I'm really surprised he stayed around as long as he has. But the idea is that Russia has won this thing, and that the president, for some reason or other, says, no, the Ukrainians can still win, or the Russian economy is really plummeting. And John, I don't know where he's getting that information from. Maybe from General Kellogg. Maybe Trump has sidelined Tulsi Gabbard or the CIA, but he's getting really terrible advice if he really believes that the Russian economy is going to be really hurt by these sanctions. It's not. It's proven
not.
that it's
The
pretty much.
Chinese and the Indians have stepped right in, and the Russian economy is as strong as it's always been.
Yeah, actually, the Chinese and the Indians have sort of waffled over the last day, but I think they're just trying to get their feet and
get the best
but
deal for
China is
themselves.
big because there's this big thing out in South Korea, I think. The big APAC summit, and
Right.
I think Trump's supposed to go to that and talk to Xi Jinping. I don't know how that's going to work out with all this stuff going on. It couldn't come at a worse time in terms of Trump's strength because it doesn't have any cards, and neither do the Ukrainians. Now, Trump himself has admitted, hey, you don't have any cards, Zelensky. Well, what does that mean? Well, we're trying to make up some cards or put a couple of aces in the pack or something. I don't know.
Right.
The thing is lost, and that's the main backdrop. And that's precisely why Putin can be so gradualist against a lot of people pressing him, for God's sake, why don't you finish him off? No, we're going to do this in a gradualist way because we want our core interests to be observed. And the only people that can really throw the weight around and observe that would be the United States. So we're willing to attrit. We're willing to win on the battlefield, and hopefully the repercussions in Kiev will be such that the army will have been demilitarized.
Mm-hmm.
Next up, denazification. Well, that's got to happen too. But without any army, what are the Nazis going to do? So Putin is playing the long game here. He's willing to suffer these setbacks in the U.S. He keeps saying, just when we were coming out of the period where our relationship with the United States was as a nadir, just all of a sudden, now Trump, like a ping pong match, has changed his tune. So one thing to remember is that these really terrible oil sanctions are not going to be put into effect for 4 weeks.
Right.
How many times could Trump change his mind
in 4 weeks?
So if you were Putin, wouldn't you relax? Wouldn't you say, look, we have the upper hand, and no matter how this comes out, we'll play the long game?
That's it. Ray McGovern, always such a treat to have you on and to see you. I wish you all the best. But tell us real quickly where people can read your writing.
Okay. My website is raymcgovern.com, all one word. I'm on Twitter at Ray McGovern, and I have a Substack.
Excellent.
Yeah, I don't really know what that is yet, but I signed up for that a year ago.
Good.
There are a lot of people I hear joining it.
Yeah, excellent. Well, Ray, thanks for being with us. And ladies and gentlemen, like I said at the start of the show, it would be a real favor to us here at Deep Focus if you would like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for being with us. I'm John Kiriakou. This was Deep Focus.